I want to talk about something that is highly important, a very crucial problem that we have in our society here in the United States that could ultimately lead to the destruction of our way of life that we know it. And this isn't an understatement. This is a problem that I would imagine every American would agree exists in our society. It's an issue that has a trifecta scenario where any one of the three parts, when acting separate from the other two, serves as a check to balance the corrupt system. And when all three parts act separate from each other, working as a counterbalance will ultimately allow prosperity and opportunity for all its constituents. This three-part issue is broken up into the following groups: the government, or politicians, private enterprise, and the workers, more specifically, labor unions. In a free and capitalist society, aka the free market system, private business, which drives both growth and innovation, specializing in the creation of new systems of production and driving economic growth via the fulfillment of consumer demand. The government, who acts as a referee and protector of the private sector, but also is responsible for mobilizing resources for projects that may be too large or difficult for the private sector to complete, both domestically and internationally. And labor unions, which serve as a check to the government and the private sector by ensuring workers are not being exploited beyond reason. If the government and private businesses are creating a work environment that is unsatisfactory for its employees, labor unions will step in. If the labor unions and the government are conspiring to take advantage of private business, the entrepreneurship will find a way around the problem and make businesses less reliable on either of them. If labor unions and private businesses are entering into unethical business practices and hiring practices that are discriminatory or create a highly uncompetitive marketplace, the government will step in and take appropriate action. Again, all three parts act as a balance to the other two. But what happens when all three parts conspire together? And what happens if all of the examples I just gave you are present at the same time? It is widely known that private business is driven by the pursuit of one's own self interest. But it is mistakenly believed that labor union leaders and politicians are not also driven by the pursuit of their own self interest. But at least private businesses are transparent about their greed and not hiding behind the same shield of being a servant for the people that politicians and labor unions do. The truth is that greed and self interest is present in all of us, no matter what sector we work in, no matter the charity that we give to, no matter which state we are elected to represent. I always say there's two types of people in the world: there's selfish people and there's jealous people. Not all selfish people are jealous, but all jealous people are still selfish. Therefore, we've created a scenario that affects society in many ways, but can really be explained through an economic lens in order to paint a very clear picture of what's going on. George Stigler laid out the problem very clearly in his article, The Theory of Economic Regulation, back in the 1980s. We've created a regulatory system that is merely a market of buyers and sellers. The buyers being private business and labor unions, and the sellers being the government, or better yet, the politicians in the government. You see, the government enjoys a power that not even the most powerful entities in the private sector possess, and that's the power of legal coercion. Only the government can take hard earned money that was earned by private citizens with the threat of jail or penalty and use that money however the government sees fit. Simply put, the government has a monopoly on legalized theft and not only regulation, but the enforcement of regulation. Don't get me wrong, there are regulations that are necessary, and I would argue that regulation pertaining to transparency, such as ingredient labels or warning labels, regulations that allow access to all information so that a consumer can make rational decisions, are all necessary, but most regulations have proven to be more costly than they are to be a solution. There's two theories that I would like to address, and both of them together paint a very clear picture of the corruption that we see today. The first one is the Coase theory, which exposes the faulty thinking of what I personally believe is the current approach and the first part of enacting regulation in an economy. It states that regulators have the misconceived belief that when A inflicts harm on B, the solution is how can we restrict A? On the contrary, the problem is actually a reciprocal one. The actual problem is to avoid harm being done to B. we have to inflict harm to A. And that brings us to another question, which is, should A be allowed to inflict harm on B, or should B be allowed to inflict harm on A? The preferred solution is one that avoids the most serious harm from being done. The theory establishes a foundation for understanding how regulation can be weaponized in our society. Regulation is power, regulation is control. Since our regulators work on the idea of restricting A so that B can no longer be harmed, we must then ask ourselves, well, who is A and who is B? The answer merely comes down to whoever the highest bidder is. I said earlier that regulation is nothing more than a marketplace filled with buyers and sellers, but it's also an auction. In George Stigler's article, he correctly claims that firms in particular can benefit from the correct kind of coercion, particularly via direct subsidies or by limiting entry. The problem with direct cash subsidies is that they are allocated based on industry or project, and the more participants in that industry results in a smaller amount of cash per participant. Therefore, regulation that limits entry is far more favorable for established firms. The reality is that regulation tends to favor small groups with strong preferences that have more to gain per capita over large groups with weaker preferences, with less to gain individually. That is why a small group of organized businesses tend to dominate a large group of unorganized consumers. All in all, regulation is nothing more than a tax paid by the losing party. Which brings us to the next theory that completes the picture of the current corruption in our system, and that is called the capture theory. The capture theory is laid out in a famous book written by Theodore Laurie called The End of Liberalism. The capture theory suggests that Congress abdicated its responsibilities of managing public policy to appointed bureaucrats, thus transitioning from a first republic to a second republic. The theory suggests that the regulatory agencies once had an initial public interest, but evolved into a system that works to protect the very sectors it regulates. It suggests that the regulated industries end up manipulating and corrupting the agencies that regulate them. Think about how Whitey Bulger utilized his connections with the FBI in order to help prosecute the local mafia and reduce competition for his own criminal activities. The capture theory lays out scenarios that generate a revolving door where politicians will end up on the boards of large businesses, which gives them an advantage to obtaining government contracts and favorable policy. This door works in the opposite direction as well. For example, Dick Cheney, who was the CEO of Halliburton and became George Bush's vice president. We all know the prosperous time period that Halliburton experienced during the Iraq War under George Bush. Labor unions and associations like the National Association of Realtors, or one that I actually was a member of for some time, which is NAFA, also known as the National Association of Insurance and Financial Advisors, take part in the internal workings as well. The NAR and NAFA are somewhat bipartisan, but labor unions are almost 100% in favor of the Democratic Party. In fact, every state that currently is a forced union state is almost entirely controlled by the Democratic Party. In these forced union states, unions are able to act on a clause in the majority of union contracts called the Union Safety Clause, which makes union membership mandatory, or the collection of union dues from non-union workers in a unionized industry mandatory as a term of employment. I also challenge you to find a union contract that doesn't limit the creation of new jobs in an industry and the hiring and firing of new workers. I challenge you to find a union contract that doesn't have a clause where business must give a promotion to a union member as long as that member meets the minimum prerequisites for that position before any outside individual can ever be considered, even if the external applicant is more qualified. And if the business did want to hire the more qualified external candidate, they would need to get union approval beforehand. The dues collected by the union are not spent for the betterment of its members, but rather used to purchase politicians and preferable regulation from the government that allows the union to flourish. Unions want to limit entry of non-unionized businesses in a sector, and the businesses want to limit entry of any business that will be a potential competitor. Therefore, they purchase regulation and policy from elected officials in return for votes and resources. Resources can take the shape of campaign contributions or the hiring of party workers. The National Association of Realtors is a great example as well, especially when we consider regulatory policy of occupational licensing. Insurance and investment licenses acquired through the FINRA securities exams are another great example. Throughout my time working in financial planning in Nashville, Tennessee, I had a client base that was primarily Real estate agents. Real estate was booming, and everyone wanted a piece of the action. Not only do you need to pass a test in order to become a licensed real estate agent, but you can expect to pay around $700 for the exam, as well as all things considered outside of that. And then you're subject to a renewal fee every couple years. Actually, you're subject to a license renewal fee every single year. I can assure you, again, from my own personal experience when it comes to securities, that on the real estate license exam and on any securities license exam and the insurance license exam, there is no information that cannot be more effectively learned through on the job experience and training than the test itself. Just like any other test that you take in school, the material and professional licensing exams do not simulate real world application. Not even close. Not in the slightest. I personally experienced this in the financial industry, like I said, where I had to pass an exam for my life and health insurance licenses. I had to pass my Series 65 exam, which is basically the securities law exam that allows you to manage money and become a fiduciary advisor. If you're getting bored of this video, I promise you keep listening because this is all going to come together. You're going to see how these firms have gained so much power, like Blackrock and Vanguard. I had to do it for my Series 7 exam, which allows you to be a stockbroker and sell stocks, bonds, mutual funds, options, etc. And again, with my Series 63 exam, which allows you to operate your Series 7 license in the state. At least a real estate license, anyone with the ambition of becoming a real estate agent can sign up and take the exam. And then you worry about who you're going to do business with after the fact. When it comes to obtaining a securities license, you have to already be employed at a firm that is qualified by FINRA, which is a regulatory agency, to sponsor you in order to take the exam. Mind you, I had to pay a portion of the exam expenses, and then I had to pay the full cost of the exam and materials for a second attempt after failing because the tests aren't easy. Yeah, I failed. I'll admit it. One could argue that occupational licensing and exams are a necessary barrier that is only in place to protect the consumer, to make sure that the client is being protected and working with an advisor that is knowledgeable and qualified. Okay, so now let's stop lying because that's not what actually happens. In fact, most people that can go and pass a securities license exam aren't worth a shit as an advisor anyway. Being able to pass a test and receive a license does not make you a good person to do business with. The actual truth is that real estate exams, the financial sector exams, and other occupational licensing exams exist for two reasons. One, to limit competition in these industries by making it costly and difficult for new entrants, thus allowing a larger market share for the already established entities. And two, to serve as a source of revenue in order to pay for the regulatory agencies that enforce these barriers to entry and were lobbied into place by the industry itself. And the true reality behind the real estate and financial industry is the excessive cost of entry, the ongoing expenses regarding the license renewal, marketing expenses, leads, and my favorite one that puts the entire thing together is the association dues for real estate agents. Not only do real estate agents have to acquire a license and pay to renew it, just like you have to do in the financial industry, but they're also required to pay annual dues to the NAR, who is one of the largest it is the largest lobbying group to the federal government. Go and look. The National Association of Realtors gives the most money to political campaigns. And real estate agents are required to pay an annual NAR membership fee, no different than unions do. And they're required to do this in non-union states. Tennessee is a right to work state, as well as pay mandatory association dues to local NAR branches, such as the Middle Tennessee Association of Realtors or the Williamson County Association of Realtors or the Nashville Association of Realtors. The insurance and investment industry is even worse, and this is where it gets important that everyone needs to listen up here. The commission on the sale of investments have been reduced so much that only those who have a large book of business or large brokerages themselves, such as like a Charles Schwab or TD Ameritrade, can make a feasible profit. The powerful financial industry firms who have actually regulated themselves into an oligopoly and has made it no longer feasible for anyone to acquire a Series 7 license. Like I said, Series 7 allows you to sell individual stocks, bonds, ETFs, options, etc. There are more retail investors, day traders, or just people who do it with their own money on their own time that are far more knowledgeable than there are financial advisors in the industry when it comes to selling options, when it comes to trading stocks, when it comes to trading ETFs. I would say the majority of retail investors are actually more knowledgeable than the financial advisors themselves. And what it has done is it has transitioned the industry away from obtaining Series 7 licensing and making these trades in individual securities to acquiring the Series 65 fiduciary advisor license. Now, what you're seeing is insurance companies and brokerages are only wanting their advisors to acquire the Series 65. This doesn't allow them to actually make trades, but instead makes them act as a risk mitigator for the large investment companies. The majority of advisors currently in the industry that hold a Series 65 will do a goal and risk assessment with their client on the basis of having a fiduciary responsibility, which is fine. They're acting in the best interest of the client. There's nothing wrong with that. And will then end up opening up a managed account, what we call a managed account, which has a minimum funding requirement, usually around $10,000. So anyone below that amount is excluded. You're not allowed to do it. Since a Series 65 advisor cannot make the actual securities trades, they can only choose a strategy that is appropriate for the clients given the risk and goals and direct the client's funds towards that particular strategy. The kicker is that the strategy can consist of a wide array of ETFs and mutual funds that seek to achieve a certain style of investment, but they are created by the large investment companies themselves. For example, the Blackrock ETF 80/20 ETF profile. So basically, what is happening is so much regulation and lobbying by the large firms has been put into place in the financial industry that financial advisors are less knowledgeable now. They are less hands on in the investments. And now all they are is a risk mitigator for the large investment companies like Blackrock and Vanguard. Advisors now are only knowledgeable in how to fill out a piece of paper and ask certain questions. They ask you about what are your goals? What's your timeline? What's your risk? How risky do you want to be? And based off of that, they're going to come up with an allocation like the one I just gave you, the BlackRock ETF 80/20, which is 80% of your money goes to equities, 20% goes into bonds or fixed income assets. And the advisor sends your money to BlackRock with that risk assessment. BlackRock takes it, compliance says, okay, we're good. They're not doing anything bad, and they invest your money. Guess what BlackRock does? BlackRock now gets control of all of that money, and inside of that 80/20 strategy can invest in the firms that they want to invest in. They can use the ESG scores to invest in it. They can use whatever their agenda is to invest that money and allocate funds towards companies that fit their agenda and their objectives. This is all in the name of mitigating risk and diversifying. Or when I was there, because I had my Series 7, I did my own portfolios. I made every client portfolio, but it took me too much time and it took time away from prospecting. And the industry has evolved into an area where they want you to act as a fiduciary and do what's best for the client. But at the same time, you have to produce. And since resources are scarce, time is scarce, you have to take away time from doing what's in the best interest of the client and keeping up with their portfolios and doing the actual hands-on investing, picking the actual stocks that you know would benefit them or the actual mutual funds that you know would benefit them. And you have to reallocate that time into prospecting and finding new clients because commissions are so low and the pay is so low at the advisory level because you're having to compete with a TD Ameritrade or a Charles Schwab who can basically offer a more streamlined service to the client for free at no cost because they're making money in different ways that you have to go and get 100 more clients to make up the difference. And for every 100 clients you have is a substantially less amount of time that you have to allocate towards actually keeping up with your clients' managed funds. There's no such thing as a money manager anymore. There is only prospectors and middlemen. All financial advisors have become is a risk mitigator to BlackRock, Vanguard, and these other large funds. That's it. That's all it is. That is where regulation and this relationship between politicians and private enterprise has become a major problem. And there's an easy fix. All of this stuff I just went over is only scratching the surface of how regulation has eliminated competition in the financial industry. This is only one small problem that is going on. And we're talking about trillions of dollars in assets. The main idea of the above examples with real estate and financial services is just to illustrate how the government regulation is purchased by large firms and an industry from elected officials in order to advance each other's self interest. I have no problem with private businesses attempting to exploit this type of opportunity, but I do have a major problem with elected officials taking part in it. You start a business to advance your own personal gain, but politicians are elected to serve their constituents' interests and not their own. There's an interesting scheme where democracy has been weaponized by both the private and public sector in order to generate favorable outcomes. You see a participant in a free market system votes by using their wallet. If a consumer prefers apples over oranges, they will simply vote for apples by purchasing them. If they prefer to travel via airplane instead of train, they will cast a vote by purchasing a plane ticket instead of a train ticket. On the flip side, the suppliers will take note of what the consumer is voting for and will take the necessary actions to fulfill desires of the customer. A true scenario where self-interest results in a net benefit for society. It is also a scenario where only those who participate cast a vote, and the only people with influence are the ones that have skin in the game. These individuals tend to be more informed and are more impacted by the consequences of their voting decisions. The more an individual participates, the more influence they will have. But the more they have to live with the consequences as well. This type of voting system may be undesirable to firms, unions, and governments alike because it limits certain actions that the firm may take in order to outcompete its competitors that may be seen as unethical or extremely costly to the consumer and society as a whole. A voter that has skin in the game is also a more informed voter. In order for firms to achieve certain desirable outcomes that are deemed unfavorable to informed voters, they need to tap into the uninformed voters. There is no substitution for holding public office, therefore, there is no substitution for having the support of public office holders. Political voting is based on a wide array of issues that the majority has little to no care or knowledge of. If a train company wants to install regulation that will increase train fare and limit entry of new train companies, that will potentially take away market share and make train fare cheaper for consumers, they do not want a vote being subject only to those who use the trains for travel. Instead, they want the regulation to be enacted by elected representatives that are voted in by a large amount of individuals that never ride the train and have no knowledge or concern regarding the industry at all. Basically, the train industry is diluting the negative votes amongst the entire population of both train users and non-users, and they are able to do this by throwing a large amount of funds and support to candidates that will act on their behalf. If a candidate doesn't follow through, then you will see the industry support reallocated towards someone that will. If you go and you look at funding from big pharma, funding from oil, funding from whatever industry, you will see shifts between the Republican and Democratic Party. All of this ties into the two-party complex as well. Labor unions support the Democratic Party, and in return, the Democratic states control forced unionism that allows unions an environment where they can collect mandatory dues and at the same time limit competition. Ironically, unions and businesses themselves have a positive relationship even though unions seek to take a larger share of the firm's profits. A firm will often see a union as a lesser cost than competition would be. What a firm loses on behalf of increased cost of labor due to union contracts, they make up for by having another entity that pushes for the same type of restricting regulations that benefits the firm itself. Labor unions have an incentive to limit the amount of firms in an industry because it results in more firms seeking to hire non-unionized labor and taking a larger share of profit away from the entities that employ their members. Therefore, they can increase the wages of their members. Milton Friedman said it best. There's two groups of people that benefit from unions: the currently employed union members and the union officials. Unionized businesses cannot outcompete non-unionized businesses, which is why union membership is drastically lower in states that allow free choice and non-union membership in due payments. There are hundreds of studies that solidify this hypothesis. And as you can see, this relationship between private and public enterprise is one that has created an environment where it doesn't matter who's elected. And there's a simple way to fix all this. The simple way to fix all this is by disallowing corporate donations to political campaigns, disallowing unions from contributing in any way, shape, or form to political campaigns, making it to where a candidate can only receive donations from individuals themselves, making it to where candidates cannot benefit from super PACs, eliminating 501c4s, eliminating any political activities that are done by 501c3s, not just putting a limitation on how much political lobbying they're allowed to do. The problem is when you go and you bring up these solutions to anyone in the political environment, you're going to be laughed at and walked out the door because they benefit from it. There are very simple fixes that can happen to eliminate the corruption in our system. The problem is the ones that have to implement the changes are the ones that have the most to lose from it. That's where we're at.